The first thing I noticed that morning was the silence, not the peaceful kind I was used to, not the calm sunrise quiet that usually wrapped around my lake like a warm blanket. This silence felt wrong. No birds, no frogs, no ripples, just still water and a smell that hit me before my brain even understood what I was seeing. A sharp, metallic stink, like chemicals and rot. I stepped onto the dock, the old wooden boards creaking under my boots the same way they had for the last 40 years. My grandfather built this dock in 1958 with his own hands. Every nail, every plank, every groove worn smooth by decades of fishing lines and sunburned mornings. This place wasn't just property. It was family history. My name's Marcus Reed. I'm 52 years old, a retired electrician who now installs solar panels around Pine Ridge, North Carolina. Nothing fancy. Just honest work and quiet living. And this lake, it's been in my family since 1952. Back then, the entire area was farmland and pine forest. No luxury homes, no HOA boards telling grown adults what color their mailbox should be. Just land, water, and common sense. Every morning at sunrise I walked the same gravel path my grandfather laid down decades ago. The stones crunch under my boots while the smell of honeysuckle drifts through the trees. Mist rises off the water while the first sunlight turns the lake gold. And right around that time the bass start jumping. For 3 years there was one fish that always came close to the dock. A huge bass I named Big Bertha. Must have been 8 pounds easy. She'd surface almost every morning looking for the bread pieces I'd toss out. Some folks think it's silly naming fish, but when you watch something grow for years, when you share quiet mornings with it, it stops being just a fish. It becomes part of the routine, part of the place. For 70 years, this lake had been untouched. Until 15 years ago. That's when the developers arrived. They bought every acre of land surrounding my property and turned it into something called Willow Creek Estates. 847 giant houses packed together like shiny plastic toys. Massive driveways, trimmed hedges, identical fences, and price tags starting around $600,000. They offered to buy my land too. More money than I'd ever seen. But selling this place would have felt like selling my grandfather's memories. So I told them no. At first, most of the new neighbors were fine, friendly even. Joggers would wave while running past the property line. Kids would stop and ask about the fish. Then one day a woman moved into the big house overlooking my lake, Vivian Blackwater, 40s something. Always dressed like she was about to argue a case in court. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, driving a white Lexus that probably cost more than my truck and boat combined. Within 6 months, she became president of the Willow Creek HOA. And that's when the letters started showing up. Official envelopes, legal language, complaints about my unsightly fishing activities. Apparently my catching dinner every morning was hurting the aesthetic value of her $1 million view. I laughed the first time I read one, because the idea that someone living in a brand new subdivision could control land that existed decades before their neighborhood was even built was ridiculous. But Vivian Blackwater didn't think it was ridiculous. To her, my lake wasn't family land. It was an obstacle, and she was the kind of person who didn't like obstacles. I just had no idea yet how far she was willing to go to get rid of one man and his fishing pole. The first official complaint arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. It was sealed in one of those thick white envelopes that lawyers love using to make ordinary paper look intimidating. Across the top was printed in bold black letters, Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I remember standing there in my driveway, sunlight barely rising over the pine trees, holding that envelope while my coffee cooled in the other hand. At first, I honestly thought it had been delivered to the wrong address, because my property wasn't part of Willow Creek Estates. It never had been, and it never would be. But when I opened the envelope, the letter inside made it very clear the sender didn't see it that way. According to the HOA president, my daily fishing activities were creating what she called visual disturbances that negatively affected the community's scenic lake view. Visual disturbances. That was the phrase she used. Apparently, watching a grown man catch bass at sunrise was somehow damaging the peaceful lifestyle of people living in $500,000 houses. I actually laughed out loud reading it, but the letter ended with a warning. If I didn't stop fishing immediately, the HOA would begin formal legal action for violating community aesthetic standards. That's when I learned the name at the bottom of the page. Vivian Blackwater. HOA President. I tossed the letter on the kitchen table and forgot about it until the next one arrived, and the one after that. Within 3 weeks, I'd received 4 separate complaints, each one more ridiculous than the last. One claimed my dock was an unapproved structure affecting property values. Another said my fishing equipment created an unsightly outdoor environment visible to residents. Tie My Tackle box was apparently offensive now, but the best one came in the 4th letter. According to Vivian, my dock violated HOA architectural guidelines. The dock my grandfather built in 1958, nearly half a century before Willow Creek Estates even existed. That was the moment I realized this woman wasn't joking. She actually believed she had authority over my land. So I called my friend, Tom Martinez. Tom's a real estate lawyer in town and the closest thing I have to a legal safety net. After I read him the letter, there was a long pause on the phone. Then he started laughing so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Marcus, he finally said, trying to catch his breath, an HOA cannot enforce rules on property that existed before the HOA was formed. So this is nonsense, I asked. Complete nonsense. That should have been the end of it. But Vivian Blackwater wasn't the kind of person who stops when the law says she should. 2 weeks later, a county inspector knocked on my door. Someone had filed an official complaint claiming my dock was illegally built. The poor guy walked down to the lake with me, looked at the original permits framed on the wall of my shed, and just shook his head. "Sir," he said, almost apologetically, "your paperwork is older than I am." He closed his clipboard and left. But that's when things started getting strange. Every morning at 6, when I'd head down to fish, Vivian's landscaping crew would suddenly show up on the property line. Leaf blowers roaring, chainsaws buzzing, industrial mowers grinding across the grass. The quiet sunrise I'd enjoyed for decades turned into something that sounded like a highway construction site, and the timing was never random. They always started the moment I cast my first line. Diesel fumes would drift across the lake, mixing with the smell of honeysuckle and wet pine. It was harassment, plain and simple. But I kept fishing, because if there's one thing I've learned after 52 years on this earth, it's that bullies only win when you give them what they want. And Vivian Blackwater had just made one very big mistake. She assumed I'd eventually give up. She assumed the letters, the inspectors, and the noise would scare me off my own property. What she didn't understand yet was that this lake had been in my family for 70 years, and I wasn't going anywhere. The first time I realized something was seriously wrong with the lake, the fish were already floating. Not one, not two, dozens. They drifted along the shoreline like pale shadows under the morning sun, bellies up, barely moving as small ripples pushed them against the rocks. For a second, I just stood there, holding my fishing rod, trying to convince myself it was some kind of natural die-off. But deep down, I knew something felt off. This lake had been healthy for years. I'd been fishing here since the day I moved into the neighborhood. Bass, bluegill, catfish. You could catch something almost every morning if you were patient enough. It wasn't just a hobby for me, it was my routine, my quiet place before the chaos of the day started. And suddenly, it looked like a graveyard. I walked along the bank slowly, eyes scanning the water, More fish. Small ones. Big ones. Even a couple of turtles were floating near the reeds, barely moving. That's when the first chill ran down my spine, because natural die-offs don't usually hit everything at once. I crouched near the edge and dipped my hand into the water. The surface felt normal, but there was a strange smell. Faint, chemical, almost like diluted bleach. Not strong enough to knock you over, but enough that once you noticed it, you couldn't ignore it. My stomach tightened. Something's in the water, I muttered. A few minutes later, another resident walked down the path with his dog. He stopped when he saw the shoreline. Whoa, what happened here? I shrugged, still staring at the water. No idea, but this isn't normal. His dog leaned toward the lake, sniffing curiously before he quickly pulled the leash back. Don't let him drink that, I said immediately. He frowned. You think it's contaminated? I didn't answer right away. My eyes were fixed on something drifting closer to shore. A large bass, one of the biggest I'd seen in this lake. It rolled slowly in the water before stopping against the rocks at my feet. Dead. And right then, something clicked in my mind. 2 days earlier, the HOA had posted a new notice on the community board. No fishing in the lake. Effective immediately. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. The lake had always been open to residents. Fishing was one of the few things people actually enjoyed around here. But the HOA had been getting increasingly strict lately. More rules, more fines, and they had made it very clear that they didn't like me fishing there every morning. Still, banning fishing was one thing. But this, I stood up slowly, staring across the water. The surface looked calm and peaceful, like nothing had happened. But beneath it, something had clearly gone very wrong, and the timing was too perfect. The HOA bans fishing, then suddenly the fish start dying. That couldn't be a coincidence. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that whatever had just been dumped into this lake wasn't only killing the fish. It was about to expose a mistake so massive, the HOA would wish they had just let me keep fishing. The moment I knocked on the HOA office door, I already knew they were going to lie. But I didn't expect them to panic. The building sat near the entrance of the neighborhood, small, all brick, overly neat, just like everything the HOA controlled. Perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect rules. Except now, the lake behind all those perfect houses was filled with dead fish. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Behind the front desk sat Linda, the HOA board secretary. She looked up from her computer with that same tight smile she always wore whenever someone came in with a complaint. "Good morning," she said. I didn't return the smile. "You might want to come look at the lake." Her expression barely changed. "Is there a problem?" I leaned slightly on the counter. "There are dead fish everywhere. Dozens, maybe more." For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, concern, fear. But just as quickly, she covered it. "I'm sure it's just a natural occurrence," she said quickly. "Seasonal oxygen imbalance happens sometimes." The answer came way too fast, like she had practiced it. "Funny timing," I replied. She tilted her head. "Excuse me, you banned fishing 2 days ago, and suddenly the lake starts killing everything in it." Her smile disappeared. "That policy decision has nothing to do with the condition of the lake." I let the silence sit there for a moment. Then I said the one thing that made the room shift. "I think someone put something in the water." Linda froze, not dramatically, just enough that you'd only notice if you were watching closely. Her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. "That's a serious accusation," she said carefully. "Then it should be easy to prove wrong." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, placing it on the desk. I already took photos, videos too. Dead bass, dead bluegill, even the turtles. And if something chemical got dumped in there, I continued, the county's environmental department is going to want to test it. Now the panic really showed. "There's no need to escalate things," she said quickly. "Escalate. Interesting choice of words. So the HOA is aware of the situation? I asked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She had just realized the trap. If she said yes, they knew about it. If she said no, they hadn't even checked their own lake. Finally, she settled on a weak answer. We perform regular lake treatments to maintain water quality. There it was, treatments? I repeated. For algae control, she said. Very common practice, but fish don't usually die from algae control. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood up from her chair. I'll notify the board. They'll investigate. Investigate. I nodded slowly and picked up my phone. Good idea, I said. Then I added something that made her shoulders stiffen. Because if this lake's contaminated, it might not just affect the fish. She blinked. What do you mean? I paused at the door and looked back. You do know where this lake drains, right? For the first time since I walked in, Linda looked genuinely confused. And that's when I realized something terrifying. The HOA might have dumped chemicals into the lake, without even understanding how the water system actually worked. And if I was right, this wasn't just about fishing anymore. The entire neighborhood was about to have a very big problem. By the time I got back to the lake that afternoon, the smell had gotten worse. Not overwhelming, but sharp enough that you noticed it the second you stepped onto the path. That faint chemical scent now hung in the air like something the wind couldn't quite carry away. And the fish? There were even more. Some had drifted into the reeds. Others were piled against the rocks along the shore. A few birds circled above but didn't land, almost like even they knew something wasn't right. That's when I noticed the maintenance tee. Ruck, white pickup, HOA logo on the door. Parked near the small service gate by the pump house. Two men stood beside it, both wearing bright green safety vests. One of them was dragging a long net through the shallow water, scooping up dead fish and dumping them into a large plastic bin, trying to clean it up, trying to make it disappear. I walked straight toward them. One of the guys saw me coming and sighed under his breath, like he already knew this conversation was coming. Morning, I said. Neither of them answered right away. Instead, the older guy leaned the net against the rocks and wiped his hands on his jeans. Areas temporarily closed, he said. HOA orders. I looked past him at the bin in the truck bed. It was half full. Looks like a lot more than algae control, I replied. The younger worker shifted uncomfortably. The older one glanced toward the pump house before lowering his voice slightly. Look, man, we're just doing cleanup. Cleanup. Interesting word. So what did they put in the lake? I asked. He shook his head immediately. Not my department, but the way he avoided eye contact told me everything. They told you to remove the fish before residents see them, didn't they? Silence. The younger worker muttered something under his breath. That's when the older guy finally spoke again. They treated the water this morning. That's all I know. Treated it with what? He hesitated. Some kind of aquatic herbicide. Some kind of aquatic herbicide. Herbicide. I stared at the lake again. Pretty strong herbicide if it's killing fish too. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something that made my stomach drop. They dumped a lot of it. How much is a lot? The younger worker answered before he could stop himself. Like 4 drums. The older guy shot him a look. Too late. 4 drums. I felt my chest tighten. You guys realize this lake, Con? Next to the neighborhood water system, right? Both men went completely still. The older worker blinked. No, it doesn't. It absolutely does, I said. Storm runoff drains here, then it feeds the holding reservoir behind the treatment building. The younger worker's face went pale. You mean the one by the maintenance road? I nodded. The one that pumps water back into the irrigation and filtration system. The older guy stared at the lake, then slowly turned toward the pump house. You're saying they might have just contaminated their own water supply? For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind rippled across the lake, pushing another small wave of dead fish against the rocks. The younger worker whispered something under his breath. Oh, that's bad. But the worst part, the HOA board still didn't know. because at that exact moment, inside the neighborhood, people were probably turning on their faucets. And if the chemical concentration had already moved through the drainage system, the mistake the HOA made trying to stop me from fishing was about to hit every single home in the community. The first complaint came less than an hour later, and it wasn't about the lake. It was about the water inside the houses. I was still standing near the shoreline when my phone buzzed. A notification popped up from the neighborhood community group chat, normally filled with posts about lost packages and lawn complaints. But this message was different. Does anyone else's tap water smell weird? Within seconds, another message appeared. Yes, I just turned on my kitchen faucet and it smells like chemicals. Then another. My sprinkler system smells like bleach. And then the one that made my chest tighten. My dog just threw up after drinking from the outdoor hose. I stared at the screen as messages started flooding the group faster than I could rear. Them. Is the water safe? Why does it smell like the pool? Did the city change something? My eyes slowly moved back to the lake. The same lake the HOA had just dumped 4 drums of herbicide into. The same lake connected to the holding reservoir behind the maintenance building. And suddenly, the timeline made horrifying sense. The herbicide had been dumped early in the morning. Water from the lake flowed into the reservoir. The reservoir fed into the neighborhood's filtration system. And now, hours later, people were starting to notice the chemical smell, the taste, the reaction. I turned towards the 2 maintenance workers, who were still standing there staring at their phones. The younger one looked pale. "Oh no," he whispered. "What?" I asked. He turned the screen toward me. It was the same neighborhood chat I was looking at. Message after message after message after message. People complaining about the water. The older worker rubbed his face with both hands. "They already turned the pumps on today," he muttered. "When?" "This morning, like 2 hours after the treatment." 2 hours. Plenty of time for contaminated water to move through the system. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a new message pinned to the top of the chat. From the HOA board. Residents are advised that the lake is currently undergoing routine maintenance. There is no cause for concern. I actually laughed out loud. No cause for concern. I repeated. The younger worker looked nervous. Do they know? "No," I said. "They definitely don't. Because if they did, they wouldn't be posting reassurances. They'd be shutting down the entire water system." Right then, another truck pulled into the maintenance road behind us. Not HOA, county. 2 people stepped out wearing bright orange safety vests with an environmental services logo on the back. The older worker's eyes widened. "You called them?" I nodded. "About 30 minutes ago." The younger worker swallowed hard. "What happens now?" I watched as the inspectors walked toward the lake, already pulling water testing kits out of a metal case. "Well," I said calmly, "first they test the lake. Then I pointed toward the pump house behind the trees, and then they test the reservoir." The older worker exhaled slowly. "And when they find the herbicide," I looked back at the shoreline full of dead fish. "Then the HOA is going to have to explain why they poisoned the same water system the entire neighborhood depends on." And judging by the panic spreading through the community chat, people were already starting to realize something was very, very wrong. The HOA board meeting that night was supposed to be routine. It turned into absolute chaos. By the time I walked into the small community clubhouse, the room was already packed. Every chair was taken. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, voices low but tense. The kind of tension that builds when everyone knows something is wrong, but nobody has been given the truth yet. At the front of the room sat the HOA board. Linda was there, so were the other 4 board members, and every single one of them looked nervous. A stack of bottled water sat on the table in front of them. That detail alone told me everything. They weren't drinking from the taps either. The board president cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he said. We're aware of concerns regarding the lake maintenance earlier today. Concerned murmurs rippled through the room. He raised a hand to calm the crowd. I want to assure everyone that the lake treatment was conducted according to standard procedures. That's when someone in the back shouted, "Then why does my water smell like chemica?" A loss? Applause and angry voices erupted instantly. Another resident stood up. "My kids brushed their teeth with that water this morning." Someone else yelled, "My dog got sick." The board members looked at each other like they were suddenly realizing the size of the problem. The president raised his hands again. "We are currently investigating." The clubhouse doors swung open. Every head turned. 2 county environmental officers walked in, still wearing their orange safety vests, and behind them, a third person carrying a thick folder. The room went silent. One of the officers stepped forward calmly. "Good evening," she said. "We're with the County Environmental Services Department." The HOA president forced a smile. "Yes, we were just discussing." She placed the folder on the table. "You dumped an aquatic herbicide into the lake this morning." Not a question, a statement. The room exploded with whispers. The president's smile vanished. It was a standard treatment. The officer cut him off, in a quantity nearly 5 times higher than recommended for a body of water that size. Now the whispers turned into gasps. "And," she continued, opening the folder, "your lake feeds directly into the neighborhood holding reservoir." Holding reservoir. Linda's face went completely pale. The officer turned one page and slid it across the table. "We tested the lake." Another page. "We tested the reservoir." Then she looked directly at the board. "And we tested residential tap water." The room felt like it had stopped breathing. The HOA president's voice cracked slightly. "What were the results?" The officer didn't soften her tone. "Your herbicide is present in all 3 locations." A wave of angry voices erupted from the residents. One man slammed his hand against the back of a chair. "You poisoned our water!" Another shouted, "You idiots dumped chemicals into our drinking system." The board members looked completely stunned, like they genuinely hadn't understood what they'd done. But the officer wasn't finished. "There will be an immediate shutdown of the neighborhood water circulation system," she said. "Residents will be advised not to use tap water until further notice." Someone near the front yelled. "For how long?" She answered bluntly. "That depends on how long it takes to flush the entire system." The room erupted again, shouting, accusations, threats of lawsuits, and through all of it, I sat quietly in the back, watching, because the HOA had started this whole mess trying to stop one simple thing: fishing. They thought poisoning the lake would solve their problem. Instead, they had just contaminated the entire neighborhood's water supply, and judging by the furious residents surrounding them now, the HOA was about to discover that banning fishing was the least expensive mistake they could have made.